Welcome back, everyone. Over to you, Nick.
Thanks, Danielle. Hi, everybody. My name is Nick Core. I'm one of the directors at Capture, and I'm joined by my colleague, Simon Mallindine. Simon's our CTO, and he's also one of the directors of the company. We're delighted to have the opportunity to present at Henry Stewart Dam, and we thought it might be fun just to talk about some of the frameworks that we use when we're speaking to our customers when thinking about how to get the most out of their digital assets. So without further ado, let's get started. By the way, if you have any questions or comments, do just drop them into the chat and we'll try and answer them as we go along. So first thing is, what is a digital asset? Well, I guess it's probably fairly obvious, but it is helpful just to do a level set here. Obviously, in our world, actually, we deal a lot with images and video content. We deal with a lot of other stuff as well, but that's kind of what we're most well known for. And so often it's digital twins that we have. So it might be a painting, an artifact, a manuscript, something that's been scanned in or photographed. So it's a twin of the original content. But increasingly, obviously, digital assets are created in the digital world, say through photography or a document you might have created and so on. I think it's kind of important to think about that when you're thinking about the value of digital assets as opposed to assets in general. And I guess the point here is that in terms of thinking about value, we've also got to think about what's going on in the world. And certainly when it comes to visual media, we know that there are numerous ways in which people can now create content natively, and they can share them, curate them very, very quickly across multiple form factors. So whether it's a mobile phone, a laptop, an iPad, a PC, or what have you. So that's great in one way, that there's so much more content that's being generated. As we all know, as folks that are involved in asset management, that also is problematic, because as we generate the volume, the so-called value or the ability to find it also reduces. But we think there are a number of ways in which we can help you solve that problem. And the way that we've thought about doing that is through a formula. So, if you say, well, how do you value something? Usually people have a way of being able to say how much something's worth. But as regards to digital assets, we haven't found anything out there that does that. So we've had something we use internally, and it works with customers and prospects when we're talking to them about framing their assets and having a think about how they then might treat them. So the first piece is scarcity. That obviously means how many of those assets are out there. Is there just one of them? If there's just a particular photograph that's been taken or a document, that helps contribute to its value. The second piece is the quality of the asset. How good is what we're dealing with? Clearly, the better the quality of something, the higher the perceived value that it might have. The next piece is significance. So how important is the asset that we're dealing with? Is it one of a kind? Is it something that captures a particular moment in time that was in of itself significant? So think about historical documents, for example. The other thing is demand. Certainly when we deal with photography and videography that's historic, if you take, for example, the passing of Queen Elizabeth recently, there was clearly a lot of demand for content in relation to her, which at some time in the past would have been less relevant. So we believe that on the top line, these are some of the criteria that you might want to look at in terms of thinking about the value. Now, as we all know, the whole thing about value is that there's obviously a below the line piece as well, which is you may have something that's very scarce, of high quality, that's really important, and it's in demand, but if you can't find it, then it doesn't really have any value at all. And we know that in our experience, if asset management systems aren't set up properly, if data isn't keyworded effectively, for example, we say you might have the best assets in the world, but if you can't find them, it's kind of worthless. And the other piece is utility. So Simon, I'm going to hand over to you just to talk a little bit about utility and whether there's anything additional you want to add on this piece here.
Yeah, thanks, Nick. So yeah, the example of Queen Elizabeth passing is a good one, that rapidly changes the demand curve and therefore the value of an asset. In terms of utility, assets can meet all of the other criteria there. They can be scarce, they can be high quality, they can be highly significant and in demand, and you may be able to find them, but if you're not allowed to use them and they can't be used in any way, then that diminishes its value again. So in terms of utility, what we need to do is promote its utility by integrating with other systems to make it available to the people who want it when they want it, to make it available within the tools that they're currently using. So if the workflow is to pull things into Canva and create social media content, then we need to make it easy to get it into and back out of those kind of systems. So it's about the tech workflow, the utility piece.
The utility, you talk about usability in terms of how easy it is.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Okay.
How usable
Perfect.
it is. Yeah.
And I think the other thing is about this formula, it's also quite a nice way to think about how you might bring, you choose the content that you might want to bring into your system as well. So that's the above the line piece. We know that back to this piece about volume, there is obviously a clear difference between quality and quantity. Volume is sometimes important, but more often than not, we kind of try and major on quality in terms of what comes into the systems that we support. So that's one way of looking at it. We said there were three. The second way of looking at things is the stages, the asset stages. And when we talk to customers, we talk about three stages. The first is ingestion. How do we get that content into the system? The second piece is the system itself, where we talk about enriching content. What can we do with that? And then finally, this piece around distribution. Typically what we talk about is being able to take content from anywhere, enriching it, and then being able to send it anywhere. So I'm going to talk a little bit about ingestion, and perhaps Simon, do you want to talk about enriching and distribution? So the point here about being able to make something valuable, back to the criteria we were talking about earlier on, is to make sure that as the content comes into the system, we're doing that in the best possible way. And when we think about ingestion, we think about a number of different methodologies that we use. They might be manual-based ingestion. They might be API-based in terms of integration. They may be FTP. But we also think about quite often with our clients about the workflow that comes alongside that in terms of the approval process. So for example, as content is submitted, encouraging users, or in fact forcing users, to be able to apply, for example, metadata to content to ensure that it becomes more discoverable. When we deal with photographers, for example, we're getting those, we're sometimes, or our customers are rejecting that content when it isn't up to a kind of minimum accepted standard. So this talks to this piece around quality, but also the piece around accessibility and discoverability as well. So, it's this science of breaking down the journey that the asset goes on, that we feel that if you can be scientific about that and use the methodologies that we use, then you can enhance its value before someone's even started working with it. So that's ingestion. Simon, do you want to spend a bit talking about what enrichment and the kind of best practice there, and also about distribution?
Yeah, absolutely will do. So Nick's touched on some of it. So the enrichment part gives us discoverability or accessibility of assets, and that enrichment can be, as Nick said, in the form of metadata that goes with it. And you do need some level of metadata with an asset in order to make it discoverable and make it usable, and that massively adds to its value. In terms of metadata, that can take many forms. We can have automatic metadata applied via templates or via artificial intelligence, or via controlled vocabularies, or all of those kind of things that allow you to at scale increase the discoverability of an asset. The second piece we touched on is curation, and that volume is not the game anymore. It used to be, in 20 years ago, 30 years ago, volume was the game, and it was all about archives having many, many millions of assets. Now, quality rather than quantity is what it's about. So the curatorial features within any system of storing assets are so important that you can find like assets with like assets in multiple different ways, and lots of points of entry into that content. Really important. And then once you've performed those pieces, there's the publication of those assets, whether that's just on a website or whether it's on other people's systems, publishing them with all that data intact and making them discoverable, and the information that goes with them. For example, making sure that when an asset appears on Google, it has the right owner details, it has the licensable badge if it's licensable, it makes sure it has the right metadata schema attached so that all the information is correct and it comes back to its point of origin. So making sure that information stays as part of that enrichment process is really important. With distribution, and this is where the value becomes realized, where the value we've been building throughout this workflow becomes realized, is when you distribute. And that can be, some people distribute to third parties who then sell it for money. There's monetization in there, and the value of an asset isn't just money. It could be about publishing out to social media channels to generate reach and engagement with a subset of your user base. It could be to send it out to sponsors or high profile donors within the organization, that you could send out to those to increase that kind of engagement. I'll hand back to you, Nick. Otherwise I'll waffle on forever.
No, that's perfect, Simon. Great. I've
6 minutes away.
No, that's all right. I've just realized that there's a slide that we should have put in, which we haven't, but I'll leave it to the end, which is what actually devalues an asset, because there's a bunch of, we could do a whole presentation on that. So let me skip through the next bits, then perhaps we can spend a little bit of time talking about what devalues it. So I guess an example you were talking about AI is, AI is good, but sometimes not great. And that can create extra work when you think you've been able to keyword a bunch of content, but actually you find that it's been misinterpreted. So let's try and spend a couple of minutes on that at the end. So so we've covered two things so far. So the first thing is kind of general principles of how an asset might be valued and how you might think about that when you're thinking about the content in your system. The second thing we advise you to do is kind of think about the stages and how those stages and the quality of those stages, the effort that you put in and the investments you make, how they might affect how an asset's value changes. The other thing that we tend to use, and this is, I know there's been some presentations on this and other events, is around, well, what's the business case for a digital asset management system? Some of our clients often feel like they've got the kind of sword of Damocles hanging over them. Why have we got this system? Why are we continue with this investment? Sometimes you're looking for reasons to reinvest in the existing system, spend more money with it, or perhaps replace it. But again, this is a kind of set of terminology that we use. I'm going to quickly whiz through these, because I think it would be interesting to talk about what reduces the value. We've covered quite a bit of this already, but again, it's just a different way of thinking about things. I mean, Simon talked about this earlier on. Commercialization doesn't equate to monetizing. Quite a lot of our clients do have an e-commerce capability in the systems that they have from us and others, but it isn't just about monetization. It's all these other things which I'm sure we know about, which is making sure that, and these are kind of like, how does an asset become valuable? Because it assists these things, like, as we've said, making sure that people can only get access to the latest version of a particular piece of brand content, or that we're able to share it with sponsors externally if we're that kind of organization, to be able to give people differentiated experiences. And so this is where the asset becomes more valuable, not just because of the system itself, but the people and the processes that we have surrounding it. So that's commercialization. So I'm going to cover the next two slides, and then perhaps we'll just have a quick think about, what doesn't help. We've talked a little bit about this earlier on, which is to say that, we often talk about, the perfect shop front in the middle of the desert. You might have an amazing, store or of content, an asset base that you have, but can't find it. It's kind of meaningless. And we know that access is one of the key drivers Often people talk about return on investment, how much time saving do we give to people by not having to ask the digital asset manager about where to find a particular piece of content. We know centralizing is really important. And that's definitely something we've seen a lot more of, particularly with COVID, is this single source of the truth. I'll come on to that in integrations in a minute. We know that that leads to better engagement. We don't want dams to be a place that assets go to retire. I mean, others have been less polite, but we know that isn't the case. And we know obviously that drives, there are monetary savings that we can associate with the value of the asset, so helping with the business's objectives. And the last piece is technology. And again, this is more about dams, but I think, it's certainly the case that what we're seeing within proposals and requirements from customers, but also prospects and tenders and things like that, is companies want to see that asset being reused easily within other locations. So a really simple one is, if you have the dam as the central repository, as we talked about earlier on, being able to link that to your front end website, your CMS systems. Often we know dams have their own web front ends, but trying to have that central source and integration, and Simon talked about that as well in terms of utility, being able to populate the content into the right place. So again, it's that piece. Great. If we've used the lens, that first lens of the asset, what makes a valuable asset intrinsically, then its value to the organization becomes unlocked through the three stages of commercialization, of access and harnessing technology. So that gives us 4 minutes, Simon, which I think both you and I are probably quite surprised about, because there's an awful lot to talk about. But we've got 3 minutes left. Do you want to talk a little bit about what are the things that, in your experience, have seen that kind of diminishes the value of an asset? You can have something fantastic. We talked some generic stuff, but any anecdotal points you can think of? We talked about AI being one.
Yeah, and I will start with AI and give people something to laugh about. That the AI, we run tests a couple of times a year, and we pick a bunch of leading AI tools and we run a bunch of assets against them. And if you're lucky, it's 83%, something like that. We find that quite amusing, that it gets things wrong. There's a rather nice little Twitter user called Neural Net Guesses Memes, that outside of this you should go and have a look if you're Twitter users, and it gives a prediction and a confidence score. And it's all very amusing, but actually having that incorrect metadata, if someone's searching for a car and it pops up and thinks it's a cactus, we're going to have a problem there. That will not only devalue that asset, but there is a halo effect around the devaluation of assets, that they will assume the archive is not a reliable place to go and find it, or they'll assume that organization can't reliably tag their assets. So we have to be quite careful of that. A really big killer is the quality piece. That's number one, is that as assets are coming in, we as an organization always make sure that the highest quality asset, whether it's a raw or a TIFF or whatever it is, comes in, and we never ever touch that. That is sacrosanct, that you must always maintain the highest quality version you have, and then generate derivatives from there. And that's a massive killer for value, is that not only does it ruin the quality aspect of it, but it ruins the utility aspect, that you can't. I was with a globally recognized client the other day, and they were talking about blowing up assets and putting them on the side of buses. So maintaining that quality is so important, because then in 5 years' time you can use it for those kind of use cases, should you want to. Sorry, my laptop's flashing at me that we're over time.
That's okay, Simon. Yeah, so again, as you probably know, this is a huge subject. Hopefully we've given you a few things to think about. I am just conscious of time, like you, Simon. Let's just get to the last slide. So digital assets, it's got a broad definition, as we've already, we've very lightly touched on. We've said, we think context is also really important. Really didn't get into that too much, but just talking about audiences, the different user communities that you deal with, they'll have different requirements and different perceptions of what is valuable. But I think that framework, that formula still works. we've talked about it in different ways, not actually used the term, but discoverability we know is absolutely critical. Thank you for listening. Hopefully it's given you some food for thought, and we'd love to hear feedback from you at the booth or in your engagement with us on an ongoing basis.